Welcome to the AI First Business Podcast with Tina Yazdi, where we show you how companies, teams, and leaders are turning AI hype into ROI. Today we have the CEO and co-founder of Monte Carlo, which is the industry's first end-to-end data and AI observability platform. Barr Moses, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tina. It's great to be here.
I'd love to dig a bit into your personal journey. Can you take us back to what first drew you into the world of data and AI? Because as I saw, that's not where you started.
Yeah, great question. So let's see. So I was born and raised to my parents. I was born and raised in Israel. My parents, my dad is a physics professor, and my mom is a meditation and dance teacher. So grew up with, sort of very different sort of types of work at home. Both influenced me tremendously. And was always sort of, kind of curious. I remember growing up, spending time in my dad's lab and, sort of experiments that we could run together and different analysis. And so was always kind of curious about what you could do with data. And then later in my career, I worked as a management consultant at a company called Bain, where we really work with Fortune 500 on their strategy. And I think the most interesting thing, or one of the most interesting things that I learned there is that we used a lot of data to help Fortune 500 organizations make decisions, and really important strategic decisions like whether to enter a new market, whether to ship a new product, how to approach a competitive positioning, what are the needs of a particular segment of your customer base. And in all of these instances, we use data, but oftentimes at the end of the day, there was not enough data to make the decision. You had to make it based of your gut or your intuition. And so I think one of the interesting things that I've learned is also the limitations of data, and that oftentimes you have to make decisions without them. And then, go for it.
I just have to double click.
Please.
Your dad's lab? What kind of experiments did you guys do together? I'm very curious.
Yeah, happy to share. So yeah, my dad is a physics professor, and in the last decade or so, we spent more time sort of on biophysics and sort of analyzing some of that. One of the earliest experiments that I remember running, I was very young.
How old are you at this point?
Like 8 years old, maybe 10 years old, maybe 12 years. I think when I was 12 years old, one of the experiments that I ran with my dad was we used Petri dishes, and we first of all, we came up with a hypothesis that we wanted to test, which was, where is there sort of a larger amount of germs on the hands of an adult, the hands of a teenager, or the hands of a baby?
Interesting.
And we basically came up with a hypothesis, and then we took a Petri dish and we took some samples from my younger sister, who was a baby at the time, and, from a teenager, from adult. And we actually sort of, grew those germs in the lab, and actually, ended up learning that the baby's hands had the most germs, which I guess is sort of, not necessarily intuitive.
No. Because you're constantly supervising and preventing them from. Interesting.
Exactly. So that was just a fun thing they used to do, when I was a kid. I remember, going with my parents to watch a movie and then, playing all these like guesstimates game, like, can you quickly calculate like how many people are in this cinema? And you kind of like quickly have to like count the number of rows and multiply. As a kid, those things are fun.
So your consulting interviews were like, no prep needed.
Going back to consulting interviews, 20 something years later, it did.
I was designed for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that was sort of fun growing up. And then, later on, so I, moved to the Bay Area, and in the Bay Area, a lot of people were sort of building in startups, and I was really excited about that. There's something magical about how startups create something meaningful from nothing. And so I joined a company called Gainsight, which created the customer success category, which, I think was just an amazing experience, again, to see, something that really didn't very much exist. Like there was no language to describe what customer success is. There was no software solutions for it. There was not really a profession for it, when we first sort of started. Fast forward a few years later, there was a movement, and there were people in the customer success profession, and it was substantiated by something. And I just really appreciated the opportunity to see that sort of magical journey, and you learn a lot from that on sort of, creating categories.
So you had several different roles. The last one you had was VP of Customer Success Operations. What was your journey like going from Gainsight to founding Monte Carlo?
Yeah, great question. So in my role at Gainsight, I was responsible for our internal use of Gainsight. So we basically called it Gainsight on Gainsight, GONG for short. And, we basically use our own solution to analyze our customer base and understand trends about them and learnings about them. So I'll give you an example. We looked for signals to give us information about our customer base. So for example, if a customer submits a lot of support tickets, is that good or bad? It could be, there's some threshold after which it's probably bad because they're inundated with issues and it's really not good. But then there's also a lower end of a threshold where too few support tickets are also worrisome because that means that they're not engaging with you at all. And so what's that sweet spot that tells you, okay, this customer is engaged, or they are actually working in the product, identifying problems and filing support tickets, but not so much that their experience is negative. And doing analysis like that, obviously this is a very basic example, but how do you use data to better inform, what does the customer base look like? How to identify opportunities for expansion and upsell and mitigation of churn, et cetera. And so I worked a lot with data. I was responsible for the data. This data was used by our CEO, our COO, our board, and also our customers. So we were surfacing this data to our customers. And you know what, Tina, I have to tell you, every morning on Monday morning, I would wake up and I would show up in the office and I would just get a barrage of emails asking me, UTF, like, why is the data wrong? Why can't we use it? What's going on?
From customers?
From customers, from our CEO. And it's really embarrassing, as sort of the person who's responsible for data. I had one job, which is get the data right, and I was really frustrated.
Simple
yes,
task.
Sounds simple. I mean, it does sound simple, right? You're like, okay, you own the data. It better be accurate because people are using it. And I remember trying to figure out how the hell can we make sure that the data is on time, is accurate, is complete, all that good stuff every single week. And it was impossible for us to do it. We had to we would get into a room and there would be this big whiteboard like I have here. And, we would start drawing out the data starts upstream here and this, it's coming from LinkedIn, it's coming from Facebook, it's coming from this, and then it's moving through here. And then we transform it in this data warehouse. And then, we dump it into S3 and then, it gets transformed into Redshift, and then at some point it's in our BI. And I was like, okay, now we have the full picture. We gotta make sure it's accurate in every step. It was this very convoluted process. And I remember thinking to myself, how the hell did no one solve this already? It just makes no sense. So that was sort of my personal experiences that obviously influenced starting Monte Carlo later when we're actually solving this exact pain point.
And one thing that I think is really interesting about your profile is you'd think, if I were to just read the description of the company, you'd think it's some PhD in mathematics or computer science, some very technical person. But while you do have that background, as we discussed from a very early age, you've worked very closely with customers and executives for much of your career. How do you think that's shaped you as a founder and a CEO and a leader? And what do you think maybe is different from some of your peers because of that experience?
It's a great question. And look, I think I've been humbled throughout my career by the importance of being customer first. And I think it sort of doesn't really matter what background you have. If you lose sight of what matters, which is the customer, you're toast. You're basically done. And, maybe taking a step back for a second, I'll explain what Monte Carlo is. Monte Carlo, which I'm the CEO and co-founder of, is a company where our mission is to help accelerate the adoption of data and AI by increasing the trust and the quality of data and AI products, right? And so what we do is we work with data engineers, AI engineers, data scientists, data analysts. All of those people are involved to some degree in building and shipping data and AI products. And for various reasons, those products are often wrong. The answer, whether this is let's call it an AI agent that spits the wrong answer, not what the customer wanted to hear or is expecting to hear, or maybe, this is, based on bad data. I can give a lot of examples here, but for whatever reason, the data and AI products are inaccurate, unreliable. And so what we do is we have a software solution that helps those teams make sure that when things break, they are aware of it and they know about that. Now, tying this back to your original question of how do you actually build a company in this space, with my background, I experienced this pain myself as the person responsible for data at Gainsight. And I remember, I'm not an engineer by trade. I don't have an engineering background, but I remember at the time going to my engineering friends and asking them, how do you all handle this? Like, what do you all do? How do you make sure that what you ship to production is reliable? And when I talked to my engineering friends, they're like, oh, what do you mean? We have all these solutions. Like at the time, this was App Dynamics and New Relic and Datadog. And they're like, once we are actually serious about shipping to production, we have a solution like that helps us make sure that, we have 5 nines and that our, infrastructure is up and running.
Sorry,
all
what
the
is
time.
5 nines?
Great question. So 5 nines, sort of the idea that when you have sort of a website, something like that, you want to measure its uptime. And so oftentimes people will say, oh, it's up 99.999% of the time. And
5 nines.
Yeah, exactly. So people will actually measure what percentage of the time your website is down. I will give you sort of a stark example. In 2016, Flix was down for 45 minutes. That's a long time to be down, right? You can't afford that for website and infrastructure. Before starting the company, I spent a lot of time doing 2 things. One, speaking with other data and AI leaders like myself and asking them, did you have this problem as well? Are you also like me, waking up in the morning, not being sure about whether the data is accurate or not? And they said, yeah, I'm like sweating at night, before we're presenting numbers to the board because I don't know if the data is going to be accurate or not. Or somehow always on a Friday at 5 p.m., right when I'm heading out to the office, this whole, disaster happens, everything breaks. I can't ship my pricing model and, to production because something's wrong. So, on the one hand, data leaders continue to validate that this is a real problem. And then my engineering friends, when I spoke to them, they were like, this problem exists and there's a solution for it that's off the shelf. Why do data and AI teams don't have this solution?
And why didn't they?
Great question. I don't know, but that's what Monte Carlo set out to, that's what Monte Carlo set out to solve. And so we ended up building a version of sort of what we think today is sort of App Dynamics for New Relic, but for data and AI teams. So we help data and AI teams make sure that they have 5 nines of data and AI availability, if you will. But at the time, I was like, I have the pain, but I don't know how to solve. I don't know what the solution is. And so coming from that perspective helped me have empathy to the pain and also resonate with sort of, the helplessness that we had as an organization.
I really like that you mentioned helplessness. Not that I was glad that you were feeling that way, but I think a lot of people, especially those that maybe don't work in the data and AI space, don't associate it with like a lived human experience. And I think this really highlights like, no, there's people here working on it. It can be wrangly. One of the things you mentioned when we chatted earlier is the supply chain of people in data and AI products, both upstream and downstream, and also how historically that was thought about and kind of what we're moving towards. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, of course. So look, let's go back like 10, 15 years ago. What did using AI look like back then? We really had like one SAP or Oracle instance, and there were just a small number of people working with data. Probably like a couple of people working in finance or IT or something like that. And, they had to make sure that data, which is oftentimes data that you would report to the street and includes things like how many customers do we have and what's their revenue and sort of stuff like that. You wanted to make sure that, that is accurate. And so you had like a small number of people was focused on making sure that the data is reliable. And then they had the whole quarter to like make sure that everything makes sense and to really sort of look at it. And so it was a small team, like a small number of people looking at the data with a very particular defined output. Fast forward to today, who isn't building data and AI products today?
Or generating data and the work that they do with it.
Exactly. Yeah. All of us, whether it's in Notion docs or Google Drive, whatever it is, we're all generating data, structured data, as well as unstructured data. We're all involved in the process.
Just in case someone's not familiar with those terms, can you just quickly define structured versus unstructured?
Yeah, of course. So structured data, if you can think about this, is something you sort of like have a table, for example. Let's take a real example. Let's take an airline. Okay, so let's say I'm working with a national airline, and they might have a table with flights for the day. So you might have a list of flights for today. And, the first column, you basically have like the flight number. And after that, you have, the time that the flight is leaving, and then the time that the flight is landing, and then, the number of passengers, and basically like a lot of details in sort of a structured format. Now, that airline also has a support chat. And the support chat bot is having conversations with Tina. Hey, Tina, how are you? Would you like to purchase a ticket today? Where do you want to go? Do you want to fly there? Awesome. This is how much it'll cost you. There's a back and forth around what that is. That text of the back and forth in the conversation is unstructured data. And so unstructured data is things like text files, images, and the way that we handle that data is sort of different. So those are sort of, by the way, fun fact, 90% of the world's data is unstructured.
Right.
However, we've spent as an organization, as an industry, we spent the last few years really spending a lot of time monitoring structured data and sort of understanding structured data. Now with AI, unstructured data is becoming a lot more important.
Yeah, and that just goes back to your point about like we're all part of this data and AI supply chain, whether we're aware of it or not. So I think anyone listening could maybe think of any emails they've sent, any documents they've created as part of the data generation that they're doing. If I understood correctly, Monte Carlo started as data observability, and now you do data and AI observability. Is there a nuanced difference between those two, or maybe a big difference? And what is the kind of shift between those things that maybe people wouldn't realize?
Yeah, great questions. Look, when we started the company back in 2019, this whole concept of data observability didn't even exist. And so, as I mentioned, Monte Carlo is sort of credited with creating the data observability category. We work with over 500 enterprises today, including companies like Cisco, Fox, JetBlue, Roche, many others across, technology, financial services, media, retail, and many others have data and AI products, and they make sure that those products are reliable and accurate. And, going back to your question, so Monte Carlo, works with companies with the best data and AI teams from, sort of the world's largest and leading organizations, helping them deliver reliable data. That's sort of where we started. Now, in the last couple of years, those teams have started building AI products. And so, if you think about, what does the data and AI estate look like today? Maybe you can sort of paint a visual picture. On the left-hand side, there's all these data sources that people ingest. So that could be things like, again, like data, from third party that oftentimes we don't even control. After that, we take the data and we probably do some transformation to it. It might include sort of a data warehouse or a data lake house, something like AWS or Snowflake or Databricks or Azure or GCP. We might have some orchestration solutions along the way, like Airflow or dbt. And then, at the very end of that, you might have like a BI solution, someone looking at reports. If you add on and expand to that the AI estate, what we're saying is that the data and AI estate are now becoming one. So thinking about the AI estate separately from the data estate, in my experience, is a mistake. Because oftentimes the AI stack is so intertwined with the data stack. And so, what are some of the technologies that add into that? You might have additional orchestrators like LangChain or LangGraph. You might have additional vector databases like Pinecone. And at the very end, at the consumption side, you likely have agents that are actually now interacting with consumers. What we are finding is that there's a commoditization of sort of foundation models that folks are using. What do I mean by that?
Right.
I mean that everyone has access to the latest and greatest model. So, regardless of who I am and where I am, I can always use like OpenAI or Anthropic or Llama, whatever model you like. And so how do you actually differentiate in that world? It's based on the enterprise proprietary data that you have. What do I mean by that? For example, let's go back to the airline example. If I'm an airline and I want to create a great chatbot experience for Tina, the best way that I can do that is by using the historical information that I have about you. For example, let's say that I know that once a year, you fly from, London to Dublin. So, I might be able to offer a personalized experience where, I help you book that ticket, for example. And so my ability as an airline to offer a better AI product for you is based on the data that I have about you. But I need to make sure that that data is accurate, right? If
I've never been to Dublin, that would be a strange proposition to receive. Yeah,
exactly. And so
it was actually Dubai, close enough, but
exactly. And so what we're seeing is that I think it's a mistake to think of AI observability or the AI estate divorced from data estate, because oftentimes when AI is wrong, it's because of the data, not necessarily because of the model itself. And so we've realized that in order to best serve our customers, we need to think about the data and AI estate holistically. And that means doing data and AI observability holistically. So we actually have to observe the whole estate end to end, from the data sources through the transformation through the consumption.
That segues nicely into kind of like digging a level deeper into this point. From like a technical perspective, and also from a business perspective, what are some foundational pieces that need to be in place to achieve that or start working towards that?
Great question. So one of the things that, most common is that people will say, well, my environment is a snowflake. I definitely, have need a different solution. I think with sort of the rise of cloud first and AI first solutions, there's an ability to offer more standardization. And what we're learning is that the first most important thing is to have end-to-end visibility. And that means really having coverage of, as I mentioned, not just looking at the reliability of your LLM model, but also looking at the reliability of the data that's feeding that model. And all the data pipelines that you're building that model relies on. Now, that is sort of the first, I think, core tenet. The second core tenet here is that from our experience working with, hundreds of organizations and, serving thousands and, many more pipelines in production, actually, there's sort of 4 core reasons for why data and AI products fail or break. And it's important to recognize those 4 and to have telemetry and forensics into each of these 4. So I'll walk through the first 4 things. The first thing that can go wrong is that you can have bad data. And by that, I mean, maybe this is third-party data that you're relying on that just didn't arrive, or that's arrived and it's like half of it is null, or maybe, it's wrong, like the values are wrong. So the first source of issues would be bad data. The second source of issues could be a system failure. So we talked prior about things like dbt and Airflow and LangChain, and in those instances, you could have a job that just failed to complete. 100% of systems fail at some point. So you're going to have something break at some point, right?
Yeah, so it's 5 nines, not 1 0 0.
Exactly. It's not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
So that's the second thing that can happen. A system that is a part of your data and AI estate can break. The third thing that can happen, which is different than the first 2, is that there could be a code change. What do I mean by that? I mean that sometimes, there's code that transforms the data. That code, someone could make a change there. A code could be a schema change. So
the system that they changed the code in is fine. The data was fine, but the code okay, just to clarify.
Exactly. That's exactly right. The code could also be the code that the agent runs on. Maybe you make a change there. A code change can have downstream implications that you're not anticipating. So that's the third thing that can happen. And then the fourth thing that can happen is that you can have everything perfect. Like the context will be perfect, the prompt will be perfect, but the model output will still not be fit for purpose. Because these are not deterministic systems, LLMs, right? And so the response, for whatever reason, might not be fit. Not be fit for your particular purpose, for your use case. Oftentimes, actually, it's a combination of all 4 of these things together. So there's a code change that resulted in a system problem that resulted in, it's sort of like the perfect storm.
It's like compounding.
Exactly. And so it's not uncommon for something to happen downstream and trigger a lot of other things downstream. And so if you want to really build a resilient system, the first thing is to have visibility into end-to-end, like I mentioned. And the second is to have good telemetry and forensics into all 4 of these things. You cannot look just at the data or just at the model or just at the system. It has to include all 4. You need to be able to say something broke downstream here, and it's because of this thing upstream, and it's because of this data source upstream. We have to have a full understanding of the system to really make sure that it's reliable.
When things go wrong and people can't understand it, that usually causes distrust and fear. And I think we've seen many examples of that when it comes to AI in production. So what you're saying is like a step ahead of that, like something's gone wrong. and you're bringing one like a MECE way of looking at the different categories of things that might have gone wrong or a combination of those things, and then getting to the forensics and telemetry, as you said. I'm curious, just from your experience working with customers, have you encountered that where like you reach a team that is super jaded, very cynical, something's gone wrong, they don't understand it, the trust is broken, so they're maybe not in a position to have the conversation that you just explained just yet because they're kind of like have this kind of like almost emotional blocker to it. I'm curious if you've experienced that, and if so, how do you navigate that kind of conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question, and I think you're spot on. Maybe I'll start by giving some industry examples of where these things have gone haywire. So, one of sort of the classic examples, I think this sort of like went viral about a year ago or so. There was sort of a chatbot that Chevrolet, created in order to allow users to buy cars online. And a user convinced that chatbot to sell them a Chevy Tahoe for $1, Chevy Tahoe car for $1. Okay, so, great job for the user, but like obviously terrible experience, right? Revenue lost, credibility lost, brand impacted, trust impacted. And I think there's a couple of problems here. Not only did you have all of that, but also you learned about it after it happened. You had nothing.
Was the car sent or picked up?
Good question. I actually don't know. I assume they would have to, but I'm not sure. But, I think in these instances, the fact that you learn about it from someone downstream makes things even worse. And so
I can just imagine the executive that had to be like persuaded that this is a good idea. And they finally said, and then this happened. And also the legal issue that comes out of that, which you kind of just touched on, which is the obligation to fulfill that.
Yeah.
Who do you go after, like from a legal perspective? Because if they had denied that request with like whatever explanation, the user, what legal rights do they have in that case? So that brings up a lot of hairy problems for sure.
Great question. I think there was an airline, I think it was Delta Airline that actually gave the flight ticket for heavily more discounted than they wanted based on sort of an AI agent's response. And the person filed a suit in law.
I think that actually may have been Air Canada.
Air Canada, yes. Thank you. That's right. And then I think they won against Air Canada.
I think they did.
Yeah. There's precedent that the legal implications are on the company to provide the service, regardless of whether it was a human that made the mistake or an AI chatbot that made the mistake.
Yeah.
So to your question about yes, there's obviously a lot of, emotions involved in this because it's not just lost revenue, increased risk, but it's also serious, they say sort of trust is very hard to earn, very easy to lose. Yeah. And it's exactly that. I do think, however, in many customers, in many teams that we work with, the path forward out of that is to recognize that you cannot build a system without mistakes. And we're not going to not build AI solutions. That's just not realistic. And so I think, data and AI teams are put in a difficult position. They need to ship AI very quickly, but we can't afford to make these sort of colossal mistakes. So I think the path out of it is by understanding that, mistakes or sort of issues with these systems are part of life. And it's not about having 100% of your, data and AI products 100% pristine. That's not going to happen. But it's how do we build the muscles and the operational frameworks and operational standards so that we have monitoring on the data, pipelines that are powering AI solutions, monitoring also the AI output. So I think an important sort of concept here is to think about we have to look not just at the output, but also in the inputs, both the inputs and the outputs of the system, and to make sure that we have not just stopping at having sort of monitoring, but also having this operational muscle of, who's catching a particular incident? How do I review on a weekly basis all the incidents that I have? And then I take that back to the people building the pipelines and build more resilient pipelines over time. So there needs to be this iterative process where we say, okay, where are the vulnerabilities in our data and AI systems? What are the things that tend to break? How do we improve so that we can have higher SLAs and higher uptime over time? And that is a journey and a process that doesn't happen overnight, but needs to happen for every single organization. And we need to get out of this, shame and, frustration and channel it to there's actually a method to the madness here. We can learn from DevOps and from what has worked for software engineering, and we can apply that here as well.
On that note, is there kind of like a standard deviation of when companies come to Monte Carlo and they understand that this is something that they need? And does it tend to be more like reactive or proactive? Like, are there some typical moments that they're like, okay, we need a Monte Carlo in place? And is that later than you'd like? And if so, when do you think is like the right time to actually think of that, in case it's not typically when companies are thinking about it now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in today's world, if you are doing something with data and AI that's being used either internally or externally, whether it's Monte Carlo or not, you need to be thinking about your data quality, data observability. Like, there's just no way around that. I think maybe, 3-5 years you could say, there's a certain point in which as a company, no company today can afford to not do anything with AI. No one. You can't. AI is sort of disrupting industries far greater than anything else that we've seen in the last decade. And certainly, in the last few years, we can't afford to sit on the sidelines. No company can. And so I think for any organization, if you're not thinking about AI, you're already toast. And in order to actually make AI work, you need to be making sure that it's reliable and that it's powered by reliable data. And so, we really see companies, various places along the maturity path, and their risk tolerance, whether they're shipping, I was just on a call with a Fortune 500 CTO last week, and he basically told me, Barr, last week I had 10 agents, but by the end of the year, I'm going to have 500 agents in production. And I have no idea I have no visibility into what these agents are going to be doing. And so I think, leaders and practitioners alike need to be thinking about building responsible AI.
No, what type of, I'm sure you speak to a lot of executives. What are the most common questions you are getting at the moment from this type of person?
I think there's various sort of things that are challenging for leaders at this point. The first is definitely talent. So the question of there's very few people in the world that have experience building with AI. And so how do you find these people? What does that mean for an enterprise? If you can't hire someone who has that kind of experience, how do you upskill people internally? What's the right profile for people for that? And so oftentimes people are looking for change agents, people who there's sort of a lot of talk about.
And we're not talking about the AI agent version.
No,
we're talking about a human change spiritual transformation, right?
That's exactly right. Someone who's not afraid to sort of bend the status quo, ruffle some feathers. And I think there's a return to first principles, meaning an understanding that, whatever playbook we had in the past might not work today. And that's applicable to any organization or to any function. So, talking about marketing, for example, in marketing, we're seeing, I think for the first time ever, Google search sort of traffic went down, if I'm not mistaken, so the rise of, search on ChatGPT and Perplexity and all those things. How do organizations market? How do organizations think about their marketing strategy in that world? And then take finance, finance as an organization, how can you use AI to close the books faster, as an example? All these things, were sort of obvious where AI can really change things, but the question is who can do that? So I think that's the one area that, leaders are thinking about. The second that they're thinking about is how do they, what are the core components that they need in place in order to actually build AI? So oftentimes that has to do with delivering AI-ready data. And so that means that they're curating financial, supply chain, marketing, sales data that they're then serving to other organizations that are building based on that data. But that data needs to be accurate and timely. So, the first dimension is how do we actually build reliable and highly adopted AI solutions? The second is, how do I make my data AI ready? And the third problem that they talk about is, how do I actually use AI to make my team better, faster? So, what sort of agents can I build or can I use internally in order to make data and AI teams more productive? And so actually one of the things that we've shipped recently, we actually shipped this a year ago, is sort of a monitoring agent, which basically automates the work of profiling.
It's like the
data.
Supervisor of other agents, or?
Good question. Not quite. It's a good question.
There's a hierarchy of agents now.
So we basically launched this suite of observability agents. The first is this monitoring agent, which by that what we mean is data and AI teams, they oftentimes need to monitor their data, but they don't know which of their data they need to monitor and what specific rules they need.
And can we just, for context, what kind of volume of data are we talking about? Because I don't think it's not an Excel sheet, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really varies. No, it's typically not an Excel sheet. So, but if you're thinking about, sort of the type of data that we have here, let's take like, a Fortune 500 or a large hotel chain and all of the data that they use for marketing. So think about like the millions of users that they have, the data about those millions of users, all the conversations that they've ever had with those users. This is pretty massive, right? This is not an Excel sheet. So you're right. It's very hard to know, what do I need to monitor? How many of those users should I care about? Which of those users am I marketing to? Which am I not? So basically this agent, what it does, it helps profile the data. Profile the data means like understanding what the data looks like, its structure, its characteristics, and then setting up monitors based on that. So that's sort of one agent. And then the second agent is what we call the troubleshooting agent. And this is something that I'm very excited about because it's one of the coolest applications of LLMs that I've seen. So, I think I was on a call with Fortune 500 CDOs yesterday, and the main theme was the main struggle that they had was, everyone's getting on the AI, everyone wants to get on the AI bandwagon, but oftentimes it doesn't make sense. And as chief data officers, they're like, we need to fend off all the various people who want to do things that actually have nothing to do with LLMs. And
yeah, it's just be an automation, for example.
Exactly. Or it's just ML, but never mind. That's a whole other episode. But in any case, when I see a real valuable application of LLMs, that's when I really get excited. So this troubleshooting agent that we released, basically what it does is as follows. What data teams do today, like data analysts, data governance, people data stewards, once there's an incident that happens, like let's say, they get an alert that something went wrong. Remember how we talked about the 4 things that contribute to unreliable systems? So bad data
in the systems, the
code, model
and the
output.
combination, and model output, sorry.
Yes. No, you're good. You remembered 3 out of 4.
3 out of 4, yeah.
So oftentimes, let's say something happened, and then Tina, you're like, okay, let me try to figure out what happened, and then you start looking, you say, it looks like the data was wrong, and then you spend more time, and you're like, well, was there a code change at the same time? Let me go look at the pull request. Let me go check whether it was something that happened at the same time. Was there a system failure? I gotta go check all my DBT jobs, make sure that they were run accurately. Basically, and then you're like, what happened more upstream? And then basically you spend a lot of time coming up with hypothesis for what could have gone wrong and you're basically doing detective work. And it's a very manual toil of going through and trying to figure out what went wrong. This is the magic of LLMs. So
Introducing
troubleshooting agent. Exactly. You basically have this this LLM that comes up with a list of hypotheses. Oh, it might have been this, it might have been that. Then it spawns off sub-agents, sub-LLMs, and each of those LLMs looks at the hypothesis. So it checks, was a problem at the data, at the code, and then they all come back with their learnings, and then this super LLM basically summarizes all that information and provides a TLDR. And then Tina, for you, instead of spending 3 weeks trying to decode what the hell happened, you basically get this write out that says, oh, here's the code changes that happen. Here are the data changes that happen. Here are all the things that contributed to this. And guess what? We can run over 100 LLMs in parallel in under 2 minutes. So we can cut down the time so you can cut down the time of troubleshooting dramatically by north of 80%.
And just want to highlight, the list of hypotheses are not necessarily going to be as comprehensive if you did them yourself, right? You may have missed a few of those hypotheses, so.
Yeah, oftentimes you would miss a ton of things. So I'm personally really excited about that. I think that's one of the coolest things.
You also touched on this earlier about the data quality maturity journey of companies. Okay. Can you walk us through, I don't know if you have, different stages with names, if not just the kind of spectrum. What is that data quality maturity framework? What would be a starting point? What is the best in class today? And where do most organizations fall along that spectrum?
Good question. I mean, I think I think there's sort of a maturity of appetite for AI and spectrum for data quality. So maybe classifying this into sort of like 3 categories. The first are folks who are largely relying on combination of in-house solutions and legacy solutions. And so these are people where there are very many people who are writing custom SQL queries to manually check that the data is accurate. So literally doing like a sum check and making sure that all the numbers are there, for example. And so that's very manual, and you oftentimes miss a lot of things. And I would say, those people in those categories, they have something in place. They're not totally flying blind. They have something in place, but their teams spend a lot of time trying to do things in a very manual way. The second category of people are organizations who are using data, have data and have an AI, and have pretty robust systems in place. So they have some sort of testing in place, for example. So they've set up some tests, and they have some monitoring framework. So a pretty basic monitoring framework, and they have some basic detection, meaning they get alerts in an automated way. Oftentimes it will be based on machine learning or AI, so they're not totally, writing everything manually. That's sort of the second, stage in the maturity journey. I would say the third stage of maturity journey, and this is really where you make the shift from quality to observability. I think quality really sort of stops short at detection. So detecting incidents automatically is very important. It's very hard to do. And you want a solution that can help you do that in a very automated way, so your teams are not spending all that time writing those queries. However, detection is just half the problem. The second half of the problem, and I touched a little bit on this, is now that I know that there's an issue, how do I make sure that I have all the information about this issue at the fingertips of this person, so this person can not only detect, but also resolve that issue very quickly and fix the system so it's more reliable? Most approaches stop only at detection. And the problem is that once you sort of start with detection, the most common problem is you are inundated with alerts and you get alert fatigue, and then no one wants to look at the alerts, and I can't watch, I don't want to hear about another issue, I can handle it. If you actually think about if you think about the fact that there's human beings at the end of those alerts that need to catch the alerts and need to actually act on it, you start thinking, how can I correlate between the alerts? Let's say I have 200 tables and there's an issue in each of those 200 tables. Is that one alert or 200 alerts? I would argue that's one alert. You don't need 200 alerts. You need one, highly automated, smart system to correlate between those 200 tables and recognize it's only one alert that needs to make its way to Tina or to Barr, right? And then we want to make sure that, Tina or Barr have all the information that's needed in order to understand actually there are 200 other tables that are impacted by this too. And so there's a lot more that goes into...
And then why are they impacted to begin with?
Exactly. We should be able to pinpoint the exact root cause of the issue and tell you, by the way, it's because XYZ made a change. Or, by the way, there was something that happened here, OpenAI upgraded the model and never told you. Okay, that happens all the time, right? And so I think, data quality is no longer sufficient. We want to be thinking about data and AI observability. And that means going beyond detection to troubleshooting and resolution.
A lot of different leaders are saying we're at an inflection point in data and AI. For you in your industry, what are some of the changes that you're starting to see, and where do you kind of see things headed next? Maybe specifically in data and AI observability, or maybe looking at it from a wider lens.
Yeah, I think, I like to say the data and AI party, we're kind of like Taylor Swift. We got to reinvent ourselves every couple of years. And so, I think the data and AI space has gone through a tremendous amount of change in the last, decade or so, for sure. And I think in a good way, if you think about, how far models have come even in the last few months, I've been really blown away. And I think there's just a big shift, a big change in what LLMs can do. That wasn't possible a year ago. And so I'm seeing a lot more non-technical people adopt AI in a way that I haven't seen before. And I love that. I think that's amazing, because I think the implications of what that we can do with, biology and research and things that are good for humanity just go way beyond that. So I'm personally very, very excited about what AI can do for research and for education. If I think about, my kids and the future, of education. I'm stoked about what AI can do. And so I think we're at a very interesting point in that perspective. And I will also say, like, these transformations oftentimes takes longer than we think. Like if you think about the internet, people thought that like the internet is going to, change things in 12 months, and it ended up being sort of a, 15-year transformation, if you will. And so I think similarly, there's some time element here. That's obviously one big change that we're seeing. And I think related to that, obviously from having been at Monte Carlo and working with customers, people are starting to notice that, as they're using AI more, as they are actually building with infrastructure, observability is typically something that follows that. So you first have to build something in production, and then you need to make sure that it's reliable. And so I think with AI, we're exactly at that tipping point where people are starting to ship things for production. And now they are starting, but we don't read every single day about a Chevy Tahoe car being sold for $1. You hear about it here and there. And I think that's the sort of tipping point that we're seeing here. And my prediction is that in the next 6 to 12 months, people are going to be using a lot more AI in production. And as a result of that, it's going to be very important to make sure that those systems are reliable. But we're just at that tipping point.
Do you have any advice for someone listening who's about to tip over into the other side? Because you mentioned several times, and I can definitely correlate that with my own experiences, things are going to go wrong. What advice would you have for someone who is going to be starting their experimentation with AI in any way, shape, or form? Things might go wrong. How should they navigate that? How should they prepare themselves for it and think about that ahead of time?
Yeah.
So and this is kind of like an innovation argument of like, it's a bit of a give and get to move things forward.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think we can't not take any risks, right? It depends on the industry. Obviously in regulatory industries, financial services, healthcare, et cetera, a lot slower to adopt, definitely things that have less predictability. I think some of the things that are easier to do or sort of easier to get started with, first of all, a lot of people, this is sort of straightforward, but they start with internal solutions. So they would start with an internal chatbot or an internal sort of agent, if you will. And then, the price of getting it wrong is perhaps not as bad. I think the second thing, though, I think we're quickly moving forward from that, though. I don't think that's sufficient today. I think it's having agents in production is critical. And so I think for those organizations, my advice is to build resilient systems and resilient machines. And my best advice, is we don't have to reinvent the wheel in a sense, like going back to the first principles, a lot of the sort of, the methodologies that have worked for us in developing software. At the end of the day, if you think about what's an AI product, it's a combination of software and data. And so you are actually seeing software engineering teams building these side by side with data and AI teams. And so I think this, if we want to build great solutions, we have to make sure that we have reliable software engineering products and reliable data. It has to be the combination of it. And I'm actually quite pleased to see these teams work side by side with each other. It gives me sort of hope for humanity, if you will. But I think it has to realize, it goes back to sort of breaking down, like, what are these systems made of and how do we make sure that each part is reliable?
Got it. And what keeps you personally energized about the space?
I'm energized first and foremost, by the work that we do with our customers and our ability to impact, and have a great impact on our customers. So if I'm speaking with a customer and they're like, we were able to ship this amazing product and, have like a great impact on our customers and, we could help them further their mission, that's what I get most inspired by. Or if, I get on a call and someone tells me, Monte Carlo like caught one data issue that was so important to me personally and basically, saved millions of dollars for, my organization and our customers. And it was a personal win for me in my career. That means the world to me. Like if I was able to help someone in their career, and to help them advance in their career, that's, I'm very grateful to be a small part of people's journey.
I love that. Barr, thank you so much for joining today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you've gained value from this episode, please drop us a 5-star rating on Spotify or a like on YouTube. See you for the next one.